Just outside Blackheath, in the Blue Mountains National Park, there's a place called Hat Hill, which you can climb. It's a very beautiful spot with stunning views, and it's where an Irishman called William Andrew Murphy used to live. In about 1913, he built himself a little stone house up here, using the stone he found on the ground, and he became known as the Hermit of Hat Hill. Apparently he used to feed the animals, and tourists would come up here and talk to him and watch him whistle up wallabies and possums and birds. He would also make brooms to sell using a local plant. You can see there's all kinds of little rock hollows around that he could have sheltered in too. His house burned down in a bushfire in the 1920s, and everyone thought he must have been killed, but he was found standing under a little waterfall that he used as a shower. After that, he wasn't quite the same and was soon taken away. Since he was born in 1846, he must have been getting on. He died in Kogarah in 1927. I love the flora out here. It's really low and alpine because of the wind. The Hermit of Hat Hill was definitely a local character, the sort of character that you could write about in a book. He makes me think a little of Eve Langley, the writer I mentioned in an earlier episode, who lived out by herself in the bush, though she wasn't quite as isolated. Mark O'Flynn wrote a book about Eve called The Last Days of Ava Langdon. I'm surprised no one's written a book about the Hermit of Hat Hill. Finding a character for a book isn't always easy. Sometimes they just pop into your head, and sometimes you have to go searching for them. With Pagan, out of Pagan's Crusade, he just popped into my head one day when I was listening to a Prince song. But a lot of the time you have to look through books and newspapers to find your character. Sometimes you can find characters in pictures. These portraits are up on my wall because their characters really leap out at me. I've always said I like faces, and these are fabulous faces. Other fabulous faces can be found at the annual Blue Mountains Portrait Exhibition, which is a celebration of people in the local community. This is my nephew, for instance, who's in a well-known band. And this is a portrait by a friend of mine who painted a friend of his. A lot of the portraits are of people who've had an impact on the Blue Mountains, rather like the Hermit of Hat Hill. And I guess the best portraits show the characters of the people being portrayed. Taking bits from real characters is pretty normal for writers, but there is more to it than that. You can't just lift someone off a wall or a page. Real people and events have to go through a creative transformation, which is perfectly demonstrated at the Blue Mountains Zine Fair, which also takes place in Katoomba, like the portrait exhibition. Zines are self-published comics and magazines which might feature made-up characters or might turn the artist or writer into the main character. There's a lovely sense of freedom in zines. You don't have the kind of constraints you get in the mainstream publishing industry. I love the colour and quirkiness of this particular stall, and since my husband is a big Steve Buscemi fan, I decided to buy him this Buscemi zine. Handing it over.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. Cool, there you go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy.
Thank you. I was interested to see the kind of characters that people were coming up with in their zines. I particularly like this zine series, Real Tales from Retail, where the writer cast herself as a bin chicken or ibis as a commentary on how retail staff are often treated. I liked it so much that I bought one. I do draw from my own life to some extent when I write fiction, because you can't inhabit a character unless you have something in common. But I tend to look outside for my characters rather than inside. For instance, I'll see something like this statue in Katoomba and I'll think, I wonder what kind of a person she is. She's supposed to represent peace, so I'm guessing pretty calm. These statues are also in Katoomba and there's a lot happening here. There are convicts working and there's a trooper supervising and Dargan or Gandungra people are watching. You can read characters into some of these statues. They're actually supposed to be a memorial to the convicts who worked on Cox's Road over the mountains. I visited that road for another video. Anyway, if you want to get your characters from memorials, there are plenty of those around the mountains. This one's about the survey of the road over the mountains by a guy called George Evans. And this is a memorial to Sir Charles Kingsford Smith, who was one of the greatest aviators in the history of the world. There's actually a whole park in Katoomba named after him. I don't think he had any particular connection to Katoomba, but he was Australian. Another good place to look for characters in the Blue Mountains is the Gnome Convention, which used to be held at Glenbrook, but is now held at the Rhododendron Gardens in Blackheath every year. Now, I'm not a big fan of garden gnomes, but I have to say when I heard about this, I thought, ooh, that's a smorgasbord of character. Nearly 2,000 gnomes rock up to the convention every year, and they put on quite a show to raise money for Rotary. This exhibit is called Gnomeo and Juliet. Apparently, some of these gnomes are more than 100 years old, and some were left to the gnome Grand Master in people's wills. Looking at these gnomes, you can start to distinguish them by character. You have your tennis enthusiast and your gardener. You even have some famous faces, like Winston Churchill, for instance, or Dame Edna Everage. You have gnomes who love pets, or you have gnomes who are in a bit of strife. You could easily write a story about the gnomes and the dinosaur, or the gnomes and the turtle. Or there's this unfortunate boating accident that left a whole bunch of gnomes in hospital. You could write a story about that too. Here are a couple of surfer gnomes. I think the one on the right is a real character. This one's a beach beauty, quite unusual. You've got your water sport fans. And you've got your selfie takers. These two are characters I could work with. Sometimes characters are defined by their passions, like cricket fans, or football fans, or golfers. And then there are characters who are more complex, like these two gnomes who are adrift and look slightly clueless. Gnomes are kind of creepy in a way, but it's not often that you see one you could cast as an out-and-out villain, except perhaps this drunk gnome. Or maybe this guy who doesn't look entirely trustworthy. And maybe a couple of these who have a pretty sinister look. I've often talked about stepping into the shoes of a character, but this would be putting on their hat. It really is amazing where you can get ideas for characters.